afternoon, everyone. My name is Hajira Mahomed. I am the founder of Culture Curator and Coach. I started or launched my business about 3 months ago. And Culture Curator and Coach is a consultancy working at the intersection of inclusion, culture, well-being, and coaching. So I just want to start by saying, especially to the mentees, I see you. Because not that long ago, or maybe, I don't know, I was sitting exactly where you are, just trying to figure it out. Hoping someone would support me, guide me, tell me that there wasn't just one way to build and grow a career. So today I want to share my story, the real one, not the polished LinkedIn version, the squiggly one. That's how I describe my career. And Fozia kind of just touched on it. It's a really squiggly career. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about my background. I was born in South Africa during apartheid. Um, so I grew up watching my country, or the country, transform through the transition to democracy, and what we call, or South Africans call, through the Mandela years. Um, so when Nelson Mandela was freed, um, in the mid 1990s, so 1994. Um, that was when I was sort of going from primary school into high school. And that time in South African history really shaped everything about how I see the world. So equality wasn't just an abstract concept to me. I watched people fight for freedom, and I also watched what it cost. I came from a working class background. I was the first in my family to go to university. I went to the University of Johannesburg. And at that time, that just felt so enormous and terrifying. I didn't really know what to study. It's quite a big decision, right? As a teenager, having to decide like a specific career. So I studied journalism because I really wanted to tell the stories that matter. I wanted to travel, and I thought becoming a journalist would be a great way to do that. And then I also, as part of that, I also studied psychology. I was just really interested in human behavior, in the human condition, in the way humans think and are. Um, and and then after studying, I came to the UK on a gap year. At the time, there was a 2-year working holiday visa that was given to South Africans, Australians, and New Zealanders. And in 1 year you could work, and 1 year you could travel. And so I was supposed to stay for 2 years, and 18 years later, I'm still here. Um, but now I'll tell you a little bit about my early career. Um, so when I arrived, I had a degree, I had ambition, um, lots of hopes and dreams, and absolutely no idea what I was going to do professionally. Um, and so I did what a lot of us do, which is sort of either work in retail, you know, while you're finding your feet. And I did that in the charity sector. So I worked in a charity shop, and I did lots of different things, but mostly I just showed up. I learned, I contributed. It wasn't glamorous, but it taught me something important. Purpose-driven work feels different. It grounds you. I was doing good work in a charity, and I was learning about how things work. Um, and then I did something that raised a few eyebrows. I applied for an internship or an apprenticeship at the National Trust. So the Heritage Lottery Fund were looking for people from diverse backgrounds to learn how to become conservators. And I knew that the National Trust was one of the UK's oldest and most beloved institutions in terms of care of collections, heritage, historic properties, and it wasn't the obvious next move for a South African journalist. But, you know, I learned so much in that time. I trained, I loved learning about historic objects. I learned about curating objects. I became a qualified scaffolder. I used my creativity in like showing off the house. I worked with local communities. And the National Trust taught me how institutions hold culture, how they decide what gets preserved and what gets left out. And that turned out to be directly relevant to everything I've done since. Um, and after that job, my mum said to me, "You have a degree and you need to stop this posh cleaning." Um, so I then moved into government, into the civil service. For a few years, I worked in the Home Office. I actually became the community engagement officer, working with Home Office officers on the ground, training them on gender equality when coming into contact with vulnerable girls and women who are coming through Calais. And that was my first work that I did in terms of equality, to specifically gender equality, but operationally. And then after 2 years of doing that, a role came up at the Government Equalities Office, and then the Cabinet Office. So in the Government Equalities, this is really where things started to click into place. So I started using my journalism or writing skills. I worked on national equality policy. I helped launch the gender pay gap regulations and worked in that team. That legislation required employers from across the UK to publish their pay data for the first time. Um, and then I worked on LGBTQ plus workplace equality policy. Um, and that was just something I'd never done before. I learned about how government works. Um, I was also using just a range of skills, stakeholder management, working with different academics. I worked on legislation, and so I was definitely starting to find my feet. And then I moved into the cabinet office to help the civil service itself become more inclusive. So that was 500,000 people who work in the civil service across 18 Whitehall departments. And in that team, I worked with um, on strategy, on a diversity and inclusion strategy, um, and did all sorts of work around, still around equalities as the common thread. So I was starting to shape the systems that affect, you know, millions of people's working lives, not just in the UK, but in Europe, and then also internally in the civil service. And I was doing it as a first generation migrant from a diverse background who came here on a gap year. So nobody had handed me a roadmap. I was building my own. Um, 5 years later, a role came up at the BBC, and I thought, this is my full circle moment. It was the BBC were looking for their first diversity and inclusion lead for BBC News. I have a journalism background. Although the role was different to journalism, it showed that I would be working on output, which was like looking at the equality of language and also making the BBC more diverse and inclusive. And I thought, well, this sounds like a role that was written for me. So, you know, I studied journalism. I came to the UK wanting to tell stories, and I ended up inside one of the world's great institutions and newsrooms. So, not as a journalist, but as the first ever DNI uh, lead in BBC News. Inside BBC, I then worked on language and equalities and inclusion during two um, conflicts. So at the time, it was the conflict between, well, The second conflict was Israel-Gaza, so the more recent one. Um, and then it was Russia-Ukraine before that. So it was a really tough time in terms of editorial. And also, the BBC, as you will know, publicly are going through a lot of change. They've got a new DG, and they're also losing a lot of staff. So it was a really tough time to be working internally and also like externally facing through editorial. Um, but in BBC, I trained to become a coach, and I coached thousands of senior professionals whilst I was there, leaders, anyone that needed career coaching. I also shaped strategy across multiple regions. I was the global lead. Um, I worked with broadcasters across Europe, including in conflict affected areas. I co created a neurodiversity toolkit with academic experts that's now being used across the sector. And I specialized in neurodiversity or neuro-inclusive coaching, having noticed that a lot of journalists were or are neurodivergent. And I learned something that I learned something there that I carry into everything I do. Inclusion isn't a program you run. It's not a strategy. It's not a policy. It's a culture that you build every single day through 1,000 small decisions and behaviors. And then this year, I made the biggest decision of my career. I left the BBC and I founded Culture Curator and Coach, my own business. It's just been something I've always wanted to do. I thought, I've had a good innings in the sort of corporate world. And I thought, let me have a go at something that I haven't done before. Because I realized the thread running through all of it, charity, heritage, government, media, was always the same. The why never changed. I know my purpose and I believe in equality, not as a policy, not as a tick box. It's something real that changes how people feel when they walk into work. I believe in inclusion for social good. My belief ultimately is if you are happy at work and you're thriving and you're growing and you're doing well, that feeling goes with you home to like when you surround the family and friends, and that has a positive impact on society. Um, and that practice is rooted in Ubuntu, which is an African philosophy that says, I am because we are. So your success and my success are not separate things. We rise together. And so lastly, onto what I've learned. So there's 4 things that I'll leave you with this afternoon. The first thing is range over ladder. A squiggly career, as you've heard, isn't a detour, it's depth. Every unexpected role I took added something I couldn't have planned for. The second thing is know your why. Purpose connects the dots, even when that path isn't obvious, and the path won't always be obvious. The third thing is lived experience is expertise. Your perspective, your background, your story, that's not baggage, that's your value. And finally, you don't have to fit the mold to lead. You can build something that fits you instead. And so just to close, I came to the UK on a gap year. I stayed because I found my purpose here. And today I'm standing in front of you, mentors and mentees alike, because someone once believed in me before I fully believed in myself. And I think that's what this program does. Don't underestimate it. And I'm so grateful to Fozia and Elam for asking me to join the program. Thank you.